The French Revolution.
So, during the Enlightenment that we just learned about, the thinkers of the time shared the ideas that people have a right to live free, and if the government is not serving them well, they have a right to overthrow the government. A driving force behind the American Revolution and the French Revolution was these ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers. They also decided to start questioning kings that claimed they had a divine right. So the Enlightenment thinkers of the time were part of the influence that led to the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, the rebels or the colonists were supported, didn't have a lot of money, they were peasants sort of, basically farmers, and so they had a lot of support from France, because France wanted to beat England. So France funded the American Revolution. They were seen as heroes over in Europe because they had supported the rebels in the 13 colonies. They were standing up for liberty and democracy and fraternity overseas, but at home in France, not so much. They were pretty much bankrupt from a series of wars. They had had poor crops due to bad weather. They also had a really not good system of collecting their taxes. And that unequal tax structure is what led to a lot of their problems. So in 1789, the King Louis XVI, decided to increase all the taxes, except not for the nobles and the rich people, which were the second and third estates. No, first and second estates. So they didn't pay any taxes. While the lower class and the middle class, they paid all the taxes. So the poor people were really, really poor, and the rich people were really, really rich and were well fed, and they were wearing fancy clothes and having elaborate parties. So the three states were taxed differently. Peasants, 97% of the population was peasants. They paid 100% of the taxes while making the least amount of money. So the working class felt exploited by the wealthy. At this point, the poor and extremely poor people, the intellectuals, all started questioning the government's authority. The monarchy are rich and they're flaunting their money, so people are like, wait a minute, what's going on? So Louis XVI calls a meeting of the Estates General in response to all these issues that France is having. So they go to the Palace of Versailles where the king and the queen live. Incidentally, the Estates General had not been called to order in about 150 years, since 1614, so maybe it wasn't a great idea. So when they get there, the nobility and the clergy allied together against the peasant class. They basically don't let the third estate join in the voting. They decide, so the third estate says, well, we're gonna come up with our own National Assembly. Well, King Louis doesn't like that, so he locks them out of this meeting. So they're left to go find another place to have their meeting. And they do. They find a tennis court. So, at the tennis court, they meet and they agree to not leave there until they have a new constitution established, which this document that they create eventually will become known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So it was created by the Third Estate. They got their ideas from the Enlightenment thinkers and watching how successful the American Revolution had been. This starts a revolution in France. So King Louis sends his troops to Paris, supposedly to keep the peace over these little uprisings that people were having. But the people see this as provoking them, and they decide, they have a little battle, and they decide to go storm the Bastille, this prison in Paris, on July 14th. The revolutionaries storm the Bastille. They're only free 7 prisoners there at the time, but they free all 7 prisoners. Their goal was actually to get the guns from the prison so they could use them, and they did.
Then the National Assembly gets together and abolishes most of the privileges of the first and second estates. So they're making some progress. And then in 1789, this rumor starts that Marie Antoinette, the queen, King Louis's wife, was hoarding all the grain. And so all these poor peasants didn't have any food. So the women peasants all got together and they decided to storm the palace and demand bread and food. They were hungry. They wanted to feed their families. They end up carrying the king and queen out, removing them from the palace. They get banished. So then a new-ish group comes in,
Jacobins.
the Jacobins, this radical revolutionaries, and they are calling for a new type of government, whereas the rest of the peasants were cool with a new type of government. They basically just wanted food and some more freedom. So Robespierre shows up, and he is trying to
Pretty much he's trying to take over, and he's really frustrated at the first and second estate. So his first thing he does is he puts King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette to death using the guillotine, which is this thing. So pretty much he cuts off their heads. And this becomes like the main source of, or like how to kill people during this time period.
They see it as like an enlightened way of killing people. Mm-hmm. It seems fair. Everybody gets killed the same way and doesn't suffer, but actually you die, so you suffer. Mm-hmm. So then the Reign of Terror begins, where the people kind of go crazy, and in all this revolutionary thinking, they end up killing many, many people in the first and second estate. They put all the traitors to death.
Mr. Cherry, could you please stop for 3-3?
And then, eventually, they end up putting Robespierre himself to death. He was kind of leading this reign of terror. They put him to death. And then the Directory is formed, looking for equality for all. They form a new government, but then they have their own issues in the Directory. And Napoleon eventually comes in. Napoleon was a war commander in the French army, and he comes in and actually becomes the like a dictator in France, the dictator. So they don't really, at that point, get to where they had planned, but then they kind of do, because they kind of end up with a constitutional monarchy eventually.
Yay!